It started with a small decision, the kind you normally don't think about twice. A moment so ordinary that if someone asked you later why you did it, you probably wouldn't have a clear answer. That evening, when I left the office, I didn't drive home. Not immediately. I just sat in the car. The engine was running, the headlights were on, and the same radio station I listened to every day was quietly playing something familiar in the background. Outside, the parking lot was slowly emptying. People walked toward their cars with the calm, practiced rhythm of the end of a workday. Some were talking on phones. Some moved quickly, like they were trying to beat traffic. Most of them didn't look around. They just got in their cars and left. I had done the same thing thousands of times. But that evening, something about it felt different. I watched the cars pull out of their spaces one by one. Engines starting, doors closing, headlights sweeping across the pavement. The usual choreography of people leaving work. But for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the same urgency to join it. I had been working in that building for nearly 9 years. Long enough to know exactly how the days moved there. Morning coffee, emails, meetings that felt important at the time, but disappeared from memory within a few days. Lunch at roughly the same hour, every afternoon. Then the slow decline of energy that arrives around 4:30 when people start glancing at the clock. Routine can become invisible after a while. You move through it the way a train moves along a track. Smoothly, automatically, and you stop asking yourself whether you chose the track in the first place. I leaned back slightly in the driver's seat and looked at the building through the windshield. Rows of windows reflecting the last light of the evening. Most of them were already dark. A few still glowed with the soft white light of offices where someone had stayed late. It's strange how a place can look different depending on how you're looking at it. For years, that building had simply been where I worked. But that evening, sitting in the car without leaving, it looked more like a place I had been visiting repeatedly without noticing how much time had passed. Eventually, the radio switched to a commercial break. The voice of the announcer filled the car with an artificial enthusiasm that felt slightly out of place in the quiet parking lot. I reached over and turned the volume down. Then I noticed something else. The silence inside the car felt unusually calm. Not empty, not uncomfortable, just quiet. And that quiet seemed to stretch the moment a little longer than usual. Normally, by this point, I would already be halfway home, driving through the same intersections, passing the same grocery store on the corner, stopping at the same traffic light near the bridge that always turns red right when you reach it. But that evening, I didn't put the car in reverse. I just stayed where I was, watching, waiting, though I wasn't sure what I was waiting for. A man from accounting walked past my car. He glanced briefly in my direction, but didn't stop, probably assuming I was just finishing a phone call or checking something on my phone before leaving. That's what people expect to see. Movement, purpose. But sitting there without any clear reason suddenly felt slightly unusual, like I had stepped out of the flow of something everyone else was still moving through. After a few more minutes, the parking lot was almost empty. Only a handful of cars remained scattered across the pavement. The sky had turned darker now, a deep shade of blue that appears just before night fully settles in. That's when the thought appeared. Not dramatically, just quietly. The way certain realizations do when your mind finally slows down enough to notice them. I realized I wasn't avoiding going home. I was avoiding something else. The strange thing was, I couldn't immediately identify what that something was. My home was comfortable. My life, at least on the surface, was stable. There was no crisis waiting for me there. No argument. No unresolved conflict. Just a quiet house and another evening that would probably pass the same way most evenings did. Dinner. Television. A few hours scrolling through my phone. Then sleep. And the same cycle again tomorrow. For years that routine had felt normal. Safe. Predictable. But sitting there in the parking lot, watching the empty spaces where cars had been only minutes earlier, something inside me felt slightly unsettled. Not in a painful way, just curious. Like a question had appeared somewhere in the back of my mind and was slowly becoming impossible to ignore. I finally put the car in reverse and backed out of the parking space. But instead of turning toward the road that led home, I drove in the opposite direction. Not with any real plan, just following a street that curved away from the office buildings and toward an older part of town. The street lights were beginning to turn on one by one. Shops along the road glowed softly through their windows. People walked along the sidewalks, carrying bags from small stores and restaurants. Life happening quietly in the early evening. I drove slowly, letting the car move through streets I didn't usually visit during the work week. It felt strange at first. Breaking a routine, even a small one, has a way of making you aware of how automatic your days have become. Eventually, I stopped at a red light near a small diner I had passed many times before but never entered. Its neon sign flickered faintly in the window. Inside, I could see a few people sitting at the counter, a waitress moving between tables. The calm rhythm of a place that had probably been serving the same meals for decades. Without thinking too much about it, I pulled into the parking lot. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment. The diner windows glowed warmly against the darkening street. Through the glass, I could see a man reading a newspaper at the counter, another person staring quietly into a cup of coffee. Simple scenes, unremarkable, but for some reason they felt slightly more real than the routine I had almost driven back into. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance. The bell above the door rang softly when I pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled like coffee and grilled food, a familiar kind of place. The waitress looked up from behind the counter. "Sit wherever you like," she said with a tired but friendly smile. I slid into a booth near the window. For a moment, I just looked around the room. The quiet conversations, the soft clinking of dishes, the low hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. And suddenly the tension I hadn't fully recognized in the parking lot earlier began to ease. When the waitress came over, she set a menu down in front of me. "What can I get you?" she asked. I looked at the menu but didn't really read it. "Just coffee for now," I said. She nodded and walked back toward the counter. I watched the steam rise slowly from the cup when she returned and placed it on the table. For a while I didn't drink it. I just sat there, looking out the window at the quiet street, letting the moment exist without rushing it. That's when the second realization appeared, even quieter than the first one. The reason I hadn't driven home right away wasn't because something was wrong with my life. It was because for the first time in a long time, I had stepped slightly outside of it. And standing there, even briefly, made the routine I usually return to feel unfamiliar. I lifted the coffee cup and took a slow drink. Outside, a car passed along the street. Its headlights slid across the window and disappeared. And for the first time that evening, I realized something that felt both simple and unsettling at the same time. Sometimes the smallest decision, like not driving home right away, can reveal how much of your life has been moving forward without you fully noticing it. And once you see that, it becomes difficult to return to the routine exactly the way it was before. The coffee was stronger than I expected. Not bad, just the kind that reminds you someone has been making it the same way for years without thinking much about measurements. I held the cup in both hands for a moment before taking another sip. The diner was quiet in a way that felt different from the silence at home. Here, the quiet had movement inside it. Low conversations, that a chair sliding across the floor, the faint clink of silverware against plates. It was the kind of place where people weren't rushing anywhere, and that alone made it feel slightly unfamiliar. The man at the counter folded his newspaper and took a slow drink of coffee. Two people in a booth near the back were talking quietly about something I couldn't hear clearly. The waitress wiped down the counter and then leaned against it for a moment, looking out the window at the street. It struck me how calm everything looked. Not exciting, not dramatic, just steady. I realized then that I couldn't remember the last time I had allowed myself to sit somewhere with no reason to be there. Not waiting for something, not filling time between obligations, just existing inside the moment. For years my days have been built around purpose. Get through work, drive home, complete small tasks that keep life functioning smoothly. Eat dinner, prepare for the next day. There's nothing wrong with that kind of structure. In fact, most people depend on it. But sitting there in that booth, watching the quiet rhythm of the diner, I began to notice something I hadn't fully recognized before. My life had become very efficient, almost too efficient. Every hour had a direction. Every evening had a predictable shape. Even the moments that were supposed to feel relaxing had become part of the same routine. I took another drink of coffee and looked out the window. Across the street, a small grocery store was closing for the night. A worker pulled down the metal gate in front of the entrance. Two people walked past carrying bags from a nearby restaurant. Normal scenes. But something about them held my attention longer than usual. Maybe it was because I had stepped outside the usual path of my evening. When you do that, even slightly, the rest of the world starts to look different. More detailed, more present. The waitress returned to my table. "You want anything to eat?" she asked. I looked down at the menu again. Truthfully, I hadn't come here because I was hungry, but ordering something felt like the easiest way to stay a little longer. "I'll take the grilled sandwich," I said. She nodded and walked back toward the kitchen. For a moment, I watched her move through the diner with the quiet confidence of someone who had worked in the same space for a long time. Then I noticed something else. The man who had been sitting at the counter earlier was looking at me, not in an uncomfortable way, just casually, the way people do when they notice someone who seems slightly out of place. He lifted his coffee cup toward me in a small nod before turning back to his newspaper. That simple gesture made me realize something. I probably did look slightly out of place. Most people in diners at that hour are either finishing dinner or stopping for coffee on their way somewhere else. But I wasn't on my way anywhere. Not really. I had come there because I had paused in the parking lot outside my office and realized I didn't want to go home yet. And even now, sitting in the booth with a warm coffee cup in my hands, I still didn't fully understand why. The sandwich arrived a few minutes later. I ate slowly, not because I was trying to stretch the moment, but because something about the pace of the place encouraged it. Nobody seemed to be rushing. The conversations moved calmly. Even the clock on the wall seemed less urgent than the ones in the office building. Halfway through the meal, the man at the counter stood up and walked toward the door. As he passed my booth, he paused briefly. "You work over at the offices?" he asked. His voice was calm, almost casual. "Yeah," I said. He nodded slightly, like he had expected that answer. "Figured," he said. Then he smiled faintly. "Sometimes it's enough to go straight home." Before I could respond, he pushed the door open and stepped out into the night. The bell above the entrance rang softly behind him. I sat there for a moment, replaying what he had said. Sometimes it's enough to go straight home. It was such a simple sentence, but something about it felt strangely accurate. Not just about that evening, about something larger. For years my life had followed the same path every day. Work, home, repeat. A straight line. Predictable, efficient. But maybe that straight line had slowly removed something important. Space. When you move through life in a straight line, you stop noticing the side streets, the small detours, the moments where nothing is expected of you. You begin to think those moments are unnecessary, unproductive. But sitting there in the diner, finishing the last of the sandwich, I realized something. Those small pauses might be the only times you actually notice your life happening. The waitress returned to refill my coffee. "You look like you're thinking about something," she said. "Maybe. Good or bad?" I thought about it for a second. "Neither," I said. "Just different." She nodded like she understood. "Different's not always a bad place to be," she said. Then she moved to the next table. I finished the coffee slowly. Outside, the street had grown quieter. The grocery store across the road was dark now. Only the streetlights remained, casting long reflections on the pavement. For a moment, I thought about going home. The house would still be quiet, the same routine waiting for me. But now the idea of returning to it felt slightly different. Not negative, just more visible, like seeing the structure of something you've lived inside for years. I paid the bill and stepped outside. The night air felt cooler than before. Standing beside the car, I looked back at the diner window. Inside, the waitress was wiping down the counter again. Another customer had taken the seat where the man with the newspaper had been earlier. The quiet rhythm of the place, continuing without interruption. I got into the car, but didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, I sat there for a moment, thinking about the simple sentence the man had said before leaving. Sometimes it's good not to go straight home. Maybe that was the beginning of something. Not a dramatic change, just a small shift in how I move through my life. And as I finally started the car and pulled out of the parking lot, I had the strange feeling that the evening hadn't been about avoiding my routine. It had been about seeing it clearly for the first time in a long while. And once you start seeing something clearly, you begin to wonder what else you might have been moving past without noticing. When I finally got home that night, the house looked exactly the way it always did. The porch light was still on. The hallway inside was dim. The kitchen felt cool and quiet in that familiar evening way. Nothing in the room suggested that anything had shifted. No sign, no visible difference. And yet I stood there a little longer than usual after closing the door, as if I had walked back into a place I knew well, but was seeing more clearly than before. That was the unsettling part. Nothing had changed, but something had. I set my keys on the counter and didn't turn on the television. For years, that had been the first move. Background noise. A familiar voice filling the room before the silence had a chance to settle too deeply. But that night, I didn't want noise. Not because I was searching for some dramatic answer. I wasn't. I think I already knew that whatever had started in the diner wasn't going to reveal itself all at once. It was quieter than that, more patient. So I made another cup of coffee, even though it was late, sat at the kitchen table, and let the house stay still. Outside, a car passed every so often. Light moved briefly across the wall and disappeared. Somewhere farther down the street, someone closed a car door. Then everything returned to silence again. That silence no longer felt empty. It felt occupied, like there was something in it waiting for me to stop moving long enough to hear it. I thought about the man at the diner. Not his face exactly, more the sentence he left behind. Sometimes it's good not to go straight home. Simple words. But the more I sat with them, the more I understood that he hadn't really been talking about traffic or routine or taking a longer drive. He was talking about interruption, about stepping outside the smooth machinery of your days, just long enough to notice that you're inside one. That had been the real shock of the evening. Not the diner itself, not the coffee. The shock was realizing how much of my life had become something I simply moved through. Not chose, not examined, just repeated. I stayed at the table a long time. Long enough for the coffee to cool slightly. Long enough for the pressure in my chest, the one I had been feeling in quiet moments for months, maybe longer, to change shape. For a while that pressure had felt vague. A low internal weight. Something without words. But now it was becoming easier to understand. It wasn't warning me that my life was wrong. It was warning me that my life had become too automatic. That's an important distinction. Wrong can be fixed. Automatic is harder. Because when a life starts running on habit, it can keep functioning for years without anyone noticing what's missing. You still show up, still pay the bills, still answer emails and return calls, and move from morning to evening without falling apart. From the outside, everything looks stable. But inside, something gradually goes numb. Not all at once. Just enough that your own days stop feeling inhabited. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm. That almost never happens. Usually I'm pulled out of sleep by noise, not by awareness. The room was still dark, and for a moment I just lay there listening to the quiet of the house before the day begins. It's a different kind of silence than nighttime. Morning silence feels temporary, like the world is taking one last breath before everything starts again. I got up, made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window while it brewed. Across the street, a neighbor was already outside scraping frost off his windshield. His movements were practiced, efficient. He didn't look up once. For the first time, I wondered how often I must look like that. A man moving correctly through his life. Efficient, predictable, unreadable. I drove to work a little slower that morning. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Just enough that I noticed it. At one of the red lights near the bridge, I looked over at the diner from the night before. It was closed, its windows dark in the pale morning light. The neon sign was off. Without it glowing, the place looked smaller, almost ordinary. And that made me smile for some reason. Because that was the thing I had missed for so long. The ordinary was never the problem. The problem was how absent I had become inside it. At the office, everything happened exactly as it usually did. People drifted in with coffee cups. Someone complained about traffic near the elevator. Daniel stopped by my desk before lunch and dropped a file beside my keyboard. Then, just before he walked away, he looked at me and said, "You seem different today." I looked up. Different how? He shrugged. Less somewhere else. That line stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. Less somewhere else. Maybe that was it. Maybe for a long time, I had been physically present in my own life while mentally standing just a few steps outside of it. Not because I hated it. Not because I wanted a different one. Just because routine had become stronger than attention. Later that evening, when work ended and people started packing up, I noticed the usual quiet migration toward the parking lot. Chairs rolling back, screens going dark, small end-of-day conversations dissolving mid-sentence. For a second, I felt the old impulse to stay in the car afterward, to delay going home. But this time the feeling was different. I no longer needed to avoid the routine in order to see it. I could see it while standing inside it. And that changed everything. Not dramatically. Not in the kind of way people write down or announce, but in a quieter way that felt more durable. I drove home directly that night. Same streets, same turns, same grocery store at the corner. But the drive felt less like repetition and more like movement through a space I was finally paying attention to. That sounds small, Maybe it is. But when your days have started blending together, small changes in awareness feel larger than they should. At one light, I watched a teenager cross the street carrying a paper bag from the pharmacy. At another, I noticed the way the evening sun caught the side of an apartment building and turned the windows briefly gold. Those things had probably happened in front of me 100 times before. I had simply not been there enough to see them. When I got home, I left my bag by the door and walked straight into the kitchen. The same chair was slightly pulled away from the table. The same dish towel hung from the oven handle. The same faint smell of coffee still lived in the room from the morning. Nothing had changed, and yet the room felt fuller. Not because something new had entered it, because I had. That's what I understood now. The distance I'd been feeling from my life wasn't created by work or routine or the shape of my evenings. It came from the gradual habit of moving through everything without really arriving anywhere. Routine had become a hallway I walked down over and over without looking into any of the rooms. The diner hadn't given me an answer. It had just interrupted the hallway long enough for me to notice I was in one. That night, instead of turning on the television, I opened the kitchen window a few inches and sat at the table with another cup of coffee. Cold air slipped into the room. Somewhere outside, leaves moved along the sidewalk. I thought about how strange it was that nothing dramatic had happened. No breakdown, no crisis, no sudden reinvention. Just one quiet decision not to drive home right away. And yet that small interruption had changed the texture of my days. Maybe that's all change really is, most of the time. Not new life. Just a clearer view of the one you're already in. I don't know if I'll go back to the diner again. Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. That part doesn't seem especially important now. What matters is what it revealed. That I had been living efficiently, but not attentively. That my days weren't empty. They were just passing through me too fast and too quietly for me to feel their full weight. And once I saw that, I couldn't pretend not to anymore. The strange thing is, nothing feels solved now. There's no final lesson. No perfect sense of peace. Life is still ordinary. Work is still work. The evenings are still quiet. But the ordinary no longer feels like something I'm trying to get past on my way to a more meaningful life. It feels like the life itself. And for the first time in a long while, that feels enough. Not exciting, not cinematic, just honest. Which, I've started to realize, might matter more. If someone asked me what happened that week, I probably wouldn't know how to explain it clearly. I'd have to tell them something simple. That one night, I didn't go home right away. That I sat in a diner and drank coffee and watched strangers move through their evening. And somewhere inside all of that, I remembered that a life can look perfectly stable from the outside while still needing your attention from within. That's all. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to make the next day feel like something I was finally inside again.